In the jungles beyond South Vietnam's borders, there were American soldiers carrying weapons that could make them look less American, sound less American, and sometimes leave an enemy patrol unsure of who had just fired at them. These men belonged to MACV SOG, the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Despite the harmless-sounding name, SOG was a highly classified special operations organization conducting missions across Southeast Asia. Its reconnaissance teams operated in places where secrecy was not simply useful, it was part of survival, and that created an unusual problem. The standard American infantryman could rely on an entire military system around him. A SOG reconnaissance team might consist of only a few Americans working alongside indigenous personnel, moving through terrain watched by forces vastly more numerous than themselves. If discovered, the team could suddenly find itself depending on aircraft, helicopters, and extraordinary firepower just to escape. The National Museum of the United States Air Force describes SOG teams being inserted into Laos to observe and disrupt communist activity along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. If one of those teams was compromised, the emergency call could trigger a desperate extraction involving helicopters and attack aircraft. On the ground, however, the first objective was often simpler. Do not let that happen. That helps explain why SOG became associated with one of the strangest collections of small arms in the American war in Vietnam. There was no single magical arsenal issued exclusively to every SOG operator. And calling all of these weapons forbidden is more dramatic than the historical reality. Some were standard American arms modified for special missions. Others were foreign weapons, experimental systems, captured designs, or equipment that ordinary troops were extremely unlikely to carry. The important distinction was not that every weapon was literally illegal for everyone else. It was that SOG operated under circumstances where normal rules of equipment could become remarkably flexible. Consider the CAR-15. To a conventional infantryman carrying a full-length rifle through Vietnam, the compact CAR-15 represented something particularly valuable to a reconnaissance man. Less weapon to drag through vines, brush, helicopters, and narrow trails. SOG teams were built around mobility. Every additional pound mattered because ammunition, radios, water, explosives, medical equipment, and survival gear all had to move with the team. A shorter weapon was easier to control when climbing into a helicopter or pushing through vegetation. But SOG's fascination with unusual weapons went much further than compact rifles. Silence, or at least reduced noise, could become a weapon itself. A conventional firefight announced exactly where Americans were. For a small reconnaissance element operating deep in hostile territory, that could be disastrous. Suppressed weapons offered something normal infantry weapons could not: the possibility of dealing with a sudden threat without immediately broadcasting the team's position across the jungle. Among the weapons associated with special operations in Vietnam were suppressed pistols and submachine guns. One of the most distinctive was the Swedish-designed Carl Gustaf M45 submachine gun, commonly called the Swedish K. Its simple appearance concealed why special operators appreciated it. Compact, rugged, and controllable, versions of the weapon could be fitted for suppressed use. American Special Operations personnel became closely associated with it during the Vietnam era. Imagine the environment in which that mattered. A reconnaissance team is moving under triple canopy jungle. Visibility collapses to a few dozen meters, sometimes less. The men cannot see what lies beyond the next wall of vegetation. Every snapped branch matters. Every voice carries. Somewhere nearby, troops may be moving along a trail. The team does not want a battle. It wants information. Because the moment sustained gunfire begins, the mission can change from reconnaissance to escape. That distinction shaped SOG weapon choices again and again. Then there were weapons designed not simply to reduce sound, but to confuse. SOG personnel sometimes used enemy pattern weapons, including AK-type rifles. There were practical reasons for doing so. Enemy ammunition might be available in the operational area. The rifle had a reputation for reliability in difficult conditions. But in clandestine operations, appearance and sound could also matter. The American M16 and the Soviet-designed AK family had distinctive profiles and firing characteristics. In the darkness or dense jungle, Hearing an unfamiliar weapon could create uncertainty about who was firing. For men whose missions depended on deception, even a few seconds of confusion could matter. But carrying an enemy weapon created its own danger. American aircraft and friendly forces expected Americans to look and sound like Americans. In a chaotic extraction, identification mattered enormously. The very equipment that might help disguise a patrol could complicate recognition when friendly forces arrived. That contradiction followed SOG everywhere. Hide well enough to survive, but remain identifiable enough to be rescued. And rescue was never guaranteed. SOG reconnaissance missions could become catastrophically dangerous once discovered. The Air Force Museum's account of prairie fire missions describes A-1 Sky Raiders supporting teams during insertion and extraction. When a team was detected, a prairie fire emergency could bring an intensive rescue effort. The tiny patrol on the ground suddenly became the center of an aerial battle. Helicopters came in low, attack aircraft worked around them, enemy forces tried to close the distance, and the men on the ground needed weapons capable of creating enormous effects without carrying enormous weight. That requirement produced one of the most fascinating weapons associated with SOG, the China Lake grenade launcher. At first glance, it looked almost impossible, a compact pump-action weapon built around 40mm grenades. The standard M79 grenade launcher was already an important weapon in Vietnam. It gave an individual soldier the ability to project explosive rounds beyond ordinary hand grenade distance. But the M79 was a single-shot system. Fire once, open it, reload, close it, fire again. For an isolated reconnaissance team facing rapidly closing opposition, those seconds mattered. The experimental China Lake launcher offered multiple shots before reloading. It was produced only in very small numbers and became associated with U.S. Special Operations Forces rather than conventional mass issue. That rarity is precisely what makes the weapon so revealing. SOG did not need equipment optimized for an ordinary infantry company. It needed equipment for extraordinary moments. A team might spend hours trying to remain invisible, then suddenly require overwhelming firepower during the few minutes between discovery and extraction. That produced a strange tactical paradox. SOG wanted weapons that could be almost invisible when secrecy mattered, and brutally conspicuous when secrecy failed. Suppressed firearms represented one side of that equation. Grenade launchers represented the other, and between them sat perhaps the most important weapon a reconnaissance man carried: his radio. Because no rifle could match what that radio could summon. Once contact became unavoidable, SOG teams could call upon a wider network of supporting aircraft. A-1 Sky Raiders became particularly important in supporting clandestine reconnaissance operations. The Air Force records that SOG teams were routinely transported by South Vietnamese H-34 King B helicopters, whose crews developed a reputation for extracting teams under intense enemy fire. So the weapons carried on the ground were really only the first layer of a much larger system. A compact rifle could keep a team moving. A suppressed weapon might prevent detection. A grenade launcher could help break contact. But if everything collapsed, the radio connected a handful of men beneath the jungle canopy to helicopters and attack aircraft overhead. Still, the arsenal became stranger. Special operations units experimented with weapons ordinary troops rarely encountered because ordinary troops did not have the same problems. Some missions required concealment, others required overwhelming short-range firepower. Some required weapons compact enough for helicopters and thick jungle. Others benefited from foreign arms that did not immediately advertise an American presence. SOG men could therefore appear in photographs carrying combinations that looked almost improvised, compared with standardized infantry equipment, CAR-15s beside foreign weapons, grenade launchers beside suppressed firearms, customized gear beside equipment obtained through special channels. The apparent disorder reflected the missions themselves. There was another reason flexibility mattered. SOG reconnaissance teams were not simply groups of American Green Berets. They commonly operated alongside indigenous personnel. The Air Force Museum specifically notes that SOG reconnaissance teams consisted of U.S. Green Berets and indigenous troops. That made weapons, ammunition, communications, and identification part of a multinational team problem rather than a simple American infantry loadout. Everything had to serve the mission, and missions could take these teams across politically sensitive borders. This is where the secrecy surrounding SOG becomes essential to understanding its weapons. Washington publicly operated within one political reality, while covert operations sometimes existed within another. The Ho Chi Minh Trail did not politely stop because a line appeared on a map. North Vietnamese logistics extended through neighboring Laos and Cambodia. To understand and disrupt those routes, reconnaissance had to reach places where overt American ground operations carried enormous political consequences. SOG was one instrument for doing that. A tiny team could be inserted, observe movement, gather intelligence, and disappear. At least that was the plan. In practice, the enemy adapted. Trails were watched, patrols searched for reconnaissance teams. Local security systems became increasingly sophisticated. And the deeper SOG went, the more dangerous detection became. That arms race between concealment and detection pushed equipment toward specialization. Camouflage became specialized, radios became critical, extraction procedures became elaborate, and weapons evolved around one brutal reality. A reconnaissance team could go from complete silence to a fight for survival in seconds. This is why focusing only on the exotic guns misses the larger story. The unusual weapons were symptoms of an unusual war. Take the suppressed firearm. Its purpose was not to transform soldiers into movie assassins, silently eliminating entire units. Real suppressed weapons are not magically silent. Mechanical action, bullet flight, and nearby impacts can still produce noise. Their advantage was more limited and therefore more believable. They could reduce the unmistakable signature of gunfire. In a conventional battle, that might be useful. For a patrol whose entire mission depended on remaining undiscovered, it could be critical. The same realism applies to enemy weapons. An AK did not turn an American operator invisible. Carrying one could introduce logistical and identification problems. But under certain clandestine circumstances, foreign weapons offered characteristics SOG valued enough to justify their use. And the same was true of experimental grenade launchers. They were not secret superweapons capable of winning the war. They solved narrow problems for men operating under extreme conditions. That is what made SOG different. Conventional armies seek standardization because standardization keeps enormous forces supplied. If thousands of soldiers use the same rifle, ammunition, magazines, spare parts, and training, logistics becomes manageable. Special operations sometimes reverse that logic. If only a handful of men must accomplish an unusually difficult mission, the question becomes less, can we issue this to an army? And more, will this help this team come home? That difference opened the door to experimentation, but experimentation did not eliminate danger. SOG teams operated against forces that possessed formidable small arms of their own. Chinese Type 56 rifles and other AK pattern weapons were common among communist forces, while rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns could make extraction zones lethal. The jungle also punished equipment. Moisture worked into metal and ammunition. Mud entered mechanisms. Vegetation caught on gear. Heat exhausted men carrying heavy loads. A weapon impressive on a test range meant little if it failed after days in the field. Reliability therefore mattered as much as novelty. So did weight. Every exotic weapon created another calculation. How much ammunition could be carried? Could ammunition be replaced? Would the weapon survive the environment? Could every team member use it? What capability was being sacrificed to carry it? For SOG, there were no free advantages. Even firepower had weight. And sometimes the strangest equipment was not designed to kill at all. Reconnaissance teams carried cameras, radios, sensors, maps, signaling equipment, medical supplies, and survival gear because their real product was information. A successful mission might end without a dramatic firefight. The team could observe a road, count trucks, identify a supply facility, photograph something important, transmit intelligence, and leave. From that perspective, the best weapon might be the one that never had to fire. Yet the men still prepared for the opposite outcome, because once discovered, events could accelerate with terrifying speed. A quiet trail becomes movement in the trees. Movement becomes voices. Voices become gunfire. The team breaks contact. The radio comes alive. Aircraft begin moving toward the area. Smoke, vegetation, and terrain complicate everything. Helicopters search for somewhere to reach the team. Attack aircraft attempt to suppress forces closing around them. The reconnaissance mission has become an extraction operation. And suddenly every decision made before insertion weapon length, ammunition weight, grenade capacity, radio batteries matters. This was the environment that created SOG's legendary arsenal, not a secret rulebook declaring that certain guns belonged only to one unit, not a warehouse of magical weapons forbidden to everyone else. Instead, SOG existed at the intersection of secrecy, experimentation, improvisation, and extraordinary operational risk. Its men could gain access to weapons that most American troops would never see, because their missions created requirements most American troops never faced. The CAR-15 answered the need for compact firepower. Suppressed weapons answered the need to reduce signature. Foreign rifles could support deception or provide useful battlefield characteristics. Specialized grenade launchers answered the need for concentrated firepower from a tiny team. And behind all of them stood the radio, the connection to the helicopters and aircraft that might be the only way home. That is why photographs of MACV SOG teams still look different from photographs of conventional American units in Vietnam. Look carefully and standardization begins to disappear. Weapons change, equipment changes. Uniform details change. The men seem overloaded, improvised, almost mismatched. But that apparent disorder tells you exactly what SOG was. It was a force designed for missions that did not fit comfortably inside conventional boundaries. Even its name was camouflage. Studies and Observations Group sounded bureaucratic. Its actual missions could involve reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, unconventional warfare, and operations so sensitive that the details remained classified long after the men returned home. The secrecy also helped create myths. Over decades, unusual weapons became mixed with veteran recollections, rare photographs, prototypes, reproductions, and internet claims. Almost any strange firearm from the Vietnam era can eventually be described online as a SOG weapon. The historical reality is more interesting precisely because it requires caution. There was no universal SOG loadout. Different teams, missions, bases, periods, and individual preferences produced different combinations. A weapon documented with one special operations element was not necessarily carried by every reconnaissance team, and used by SOG does not automatically mean exclusive to SOG. But the pattern is unmistakable. MACV SOG had extraordinary access because it had extraordinary requirements. Its operators were being asked to cross into places where their government often preferred not to acknowledge American ground forces were operating, gather intelligence beneath the noses of enemy units, and somehow return. For that mission, the ordinary infantryman's equipment was sometimes enough. Sometimes it wasn't. And when it wasn't, SOG became a laboratory. Compact rifles, suppressors, foreign weapons, experimental launchers, specialized communications equipment, each represented an attempt to solve a problem created by clandestine war. The weapons became famous because they were unusual. The reason they existed is darker. They were tools built around the expectation that a few men might suddenly find themselves isolated, surrounded, and very far from help. In those moments, the difference between an ordinary weapon and an unusual one could be measured in seconds. A few seconds before the enemy located the team. A few seconds faster, breaking contact. A few seconds gained while helicopters approached. And sometimes, a few seconds were all MACV SOG needed to disappear back into the jungle. The so-called forbidden weapons of SOG were never really the heart of the story. The heart of the story was the mission that made such weapons necessary. America had created a secret force to fight in the shadows of an already controversial war. And because its missions existed outside the experience of ordinary soldiers, its arsenal did too. The strangest guns carried in Southeast Asia were not symbols of unlimited power. They were evidence of just how dangerous the missions had become.